Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us better see both sides of complex issues and navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guests for today. I have on the panel Sam Artery, who's a national mediator, trial lawyer, consultant, speaker, and author. He teaches negotiation at Indiana University's Maurer School of Law and is author of Positively Conflicted, Engaging with Courage, Compassion, and Wisdom in a Combative World. Jo Irvin is an accountant, an auditor, and an ethics speaker who prides herself on not being your typical accountant, auditor, or ethics speaker. She is author of Becoming the Everyday Ethicist. And Diane Wiska, RN, JD, and story consultant, is founder of the Engaged Storyism Method. She helps professionals identify, shape, and deliver their messaging stories with value and heart that are understood, remembered, recalled, and acted upon. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank
Glad
you.
to be here.
Thank you.
And here is today's ethics challenge. Daniel owned a neighborhood restaurant. One day, he received a frantic call from his friend Michael, who owned a local catering business. My freezer just broke down. Can I store a few cases of chicken in your freezer for a week or two until I get mine repaired? Daniel had room to spare and was happy to help Michael out. When Michael arrived with the chickens, Daniel noticed that the expiration date on the cartons was past due. He pointed this out to Michael, who shrugged it off. The expiration date only applies when they're fresh, he said. Once they're frozen, you can keep them forever. Daniel wasn't so sure, but it was Michael's business, so he let the matter drop. 3 months later, despite repeated calls from Daniel, Michael still had not picked up his chickens. One afternoon, Daniel got a call from a nearby restaurateur. The inspectors are making surprise visits this week, he told Daniel. They've already dropped in on me, and they could be at your place any moment. Make sure you have everything in order. Daniel remembered the expiration date on Michael's chickens. The inspectors might not agree with Michael's reasoning and might not believe that Daniel was storing them for someone else. They might fine him or even shut him down. Daniel decided he had given Michael enough chances. He carried the chicken cases out into the back alley and tossed them into his dumpster. A few hours later, Michael showed up unannounced. I'm here for my chickens, he said with a smile. Daniel explained why he hadn't been able to hold Michael's chickens any longer, saying he was free to retrieve them from the dumpster. However, in the summer heat, the chickens had defrosted enough to attract some local cats, which had rendered the chickens unfit for humans. Michael demanded that Daniel compensate him for the chickens. Daniel replied that he had ceased to be responsible when Michael failed to retrieve his chickens on time and after repeated requests to do so. Does Daniel have to compensate Michael for the chickens? The floor is open.
Well, I usually deal with things as a mediator after everything's gone to hell in a handbasket. So I deal with it once they've decided, Daniel's decided not to pay and Michael sues Daniel and the rest of it. So going to the end game first, my answer is absolutely does not have to pay him as long as he's willing to pay the price for not paying him, which could be the end of a friendship, which could hurt his business, which could be a lawsuit. So that's the end. There are a lot of things that go into it, but that's kind of the place I tend to go because I think nobody has to do anything as long as they're willing to pay the price for not doing it. And I think that's a bigger question, ethically and legally.
Lady?
Well, I was hoping that I could send both men to you, Sam, and that not being the case, the way I'm looking at it is that is similar. Both men should just shake hands and walk away from this, because if you mess up, you fess up, and both of them have messed up. In addition to that, I think that there's an element of failure to do right here or failure to do the right thing. And so as I'm looking at it at this moment in time, neither owes either anything, and they should just give a good handshake and walk away from the situation.
My gut, when I read this one in Jonason's book, was that when you have a feeling that something is wrong from the very beginning, That to me is super important. The ethics issue was crossed at the very, very beginning when he felt like he shouldn't take the chickens or have them in his freezer. So that's where, to me, the first lack of ethical action happened. If you're uncomfortable with it, the choice should have been made then. I think, unfortunately, because he didn't make the choice then, he then had to face paying for it later, at the end of the day. So, I think it almost came back to haunt him per se. But that was my initial reaction, was that the ethical decision was actually at the beginning, not at the end of the scenario.
I think that's a great point, Joe, and it reminds me of the old Peanuts comic strip. I think it was Linus who says, "I believe that no problem is so big that you can't run away from it." And most of us default to doing just that. We don't want to deal with things in the moment because we'd rather kick the can down the road. And then we are creating bigger problems for ourselves and others. So I think that's a really astute point, that the first ethical issue here is not addressing the problem when it immediately arises. But Diane, you said something I'd like to explore. You said that both of them messed up. So aside from Joe's point, Michael repeatedly failed to do what he said he would do. Where do you see that Daniel messed up?
Well, there's any number of opportunities he had. I mean, he said, so Michael said a couple of weeks. That's all it's going to take to get the freezer done. And so if Daniel was that good of a friend to accept this property in his freezer for a while and the couple of weeks had expired, unless he's talking crates of chicken, he could have dropped them back off again. So he's done a good job by calling. But at what point in time do you stop calling and saying, come and get this? I mean, it seems to me that if you're going to kick the problem down the road, calling him for 3 months is still kicking the problem down the road. And at any point in time, because he's running a restaurant, the inspector could have come through. It was just by luck that someone called him and gave him a heads up and said, oh, the inspector's on his way. But by taking the chickens and acknowledging Joe's point about whether that was the right thing to do or not, he's a restaurateur. He should know about expired chickens and frozen or not. He had the opportunity at any point in time to give this stuff back. He had the opportunity when he got the call from the friend saying the inspector's on the way to get rid of them then by dropping them back off with Michael. So I guess the way I'm looking at it is, apart from the several months of calls, which is kicking the can down the road, he could have dropped them off. He could have gotten rid of them then. He could have called Michael and said, hey, look, the inspector's on his way here. I don't want to run the risk. If you don't come and get your chickens now, I'm throwing them in the dumpster, because I don't want to run the risk that the inspector will come and find your stuff in my freezer.
Yeah, I think that's a really easy way that Daniel could have really exempted himself from any claim against him.
Well, yeah.
Stuff's been here for 3 months. The inspectors are in town. I'm putting it out in the back. I don't know if he had to put it in the dumpster. Maybe he could have put it in the trunk of his car. So what do you think, Sam?
Well, I was just thinking it was interesting that the ultimate decision by Daniel was completely fear-based. I mean, he was fine leaving him there. He was calling, I mean, fine might be not the right word, but it was only when he was afraid there might be a consequence to him that he felt compelled to take action. And the action he felt compelled to take was immediate and extreme. I guess going back to what Joe said, and maybe this plays into the gray area. And I don't find that discomfort necessarily indicates that there's an ethical problem. I think discomfort indicates that there's something for me to pause and think about. Because and the reason I say that, I think I was talking to somebody recently who was doing some marriage counseling. And he was telling the therapist, I don't want to tell my wife this because I just don't want to be unkind, or it wasn't anything bad or anything like that. And the therapist's response was, well, it's not that you don't want to tell your wife, you don't want to deal with her response to telling her what's going on. And I think So I think he did kick the can down the road, but because we all think we have the right amount of common sense, Daniel thought, well, when I tell Michael this, then he's going to understand that I'm uncomfortable with this and he's going to take care of it. So and then he thought, well, 1 or 2 weeks is no big deal. I'm willing to live with that. And then it went longer and longer. And 1 or 2 weeks can seem like, if I tell you I'm going to be there in a minute, it's probably not going to be exactly a minute. And my guess is 1 or 2 weeks, what Daniel thought about 1 or 2 weeks and what Michael thought about one or 2 weeks at the beginning, probably neither one really clarified it.
I'd like to continue that conversation that Sam started there by saying, I think there is a difference between talking about ethics and what are your personal values. And I try to really bring it up a level, or really think about things like, I say the everyday ethicist meets or exceeds commitments. So they live by the motto, a promise is a promise. And so, to me, a personal value of commitments is a choice to be ethical. So, it really comes down to what all do you encompass in your ethics. And so, I think that, we could probably talk about everybody's different meaning of ethics, but I think I lump a lot more into ethics than some people would. So I look at this as, if it was uncomfortable to him, that's not a value he would do business. He would not do business like that. He doesn't have anything in his freezer that's expired. He needs to not compromise his value system for a friend. I always say, you've got to make the right choice the first time, whether you lose a boss, a job, a friend. So, that's kind of the, he probably, in my mind, could have saved a friendship and saved the fear of a restaurant inspection if he would have made the decision going along with his own value system at the very beginning. And the only other thing I'll say to Diane's and at really Sam's, everyone's point is, I think, unfortunately, this scenario is a perfect example of what happens in corporate America. It's always reacting to a crisis. It is Boeing not really implementing the proper procedures for their software, their flight software system prior to 2 crashes. It's them blaming the pilots after, and then, reacting to the disaster of the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. So, it's that ethics needs to be a proactive decision that companies and people make at the beginning. So right way the first time is my motto there.
Well, we certainly eliminate a lot of problems if we address things as they come up. But we're really alluding to a topic that's come up before in a previous panel, that sometimes our own standard of ethics calls on us to act a certain way. But when we're engaging with people with whom we have relationships who don't have our same standard of ethics, making choices for themselves, where there's a certain amount of spillover, and it can be very awkward and even unclear. Because if I were making this decision for me, I know what I would do. That person making that decision for them, they're entitled to set the bar where they choose. But now our fortunes are somewhat intermingled. Do I have the moral authority to impose myself or to decline to help a friend, because that's also a value, when the friend is indulging in a certain value system that's inconsistent with mine? It gets awfully murky.
Well, I was thinking even about kind of going back to what Joe said in the ethics is how we behave personally. And this is when we've got 3 daughters, they're married, we go to their houses, we visit them and hang out. They have very different ways to keep their refrigerators. And one of our kids, the day before something expires, they're not going to eat it. But if they know my wife and I are going to come, we'll eat things 2 weeks after they're expired. It just doesn't, probably not sushi, but we will. And so from our standpoint, the way we live, I'm not worried about that most of the time. And so that may be just a different, if we've got, requirements and Board of Health and things like that that are not part of this problem. The other thing I was thinking about when I was reading these facts, I was thinking, whose facts are they? Is this Is this Daniel's version? Is this Michael's version? Because I think when I tell a story, I got fired several years ago, and I got fired 3 weeks before Christmas when my wife was pregnant with our first child, and we just bought a house. Now, if I tell the story that way, they, what a horrible thing to do. Well, I was a horrible employee. I was arrogant and with the people that employed me. I was entitled. There are all kinds of reasons for them to fire me. But if I begin the story that way, I think, well, how could somebody do that to somebody? Well, they were really decent people who fired me. I needed to be fired. But that's not the way I'm likely to tell the story. And it's certainly not the way I would have told the story at the time it happened.
You know, I think the mitigating factor here on Daniel's side is that he felt that there was an imminent threat to the welfare of his business, combined with Michael having really failed to uphold the conditions that he set at the beginning. Now, we can and perhaps should hold Daniel accountable, as Joe, you said so articulately, that he shouldn't have allowed himself to get into this situation. But once he was trying to be a good friend. He was trying to help somebody out in need. He felt taken advantage of. And now he feels like, no good deed goes unpunished. I'm gonna have to pay for this. I can certainly sympathize with his sense of urgency. You mentioned he does it out of fear, Sam, and I think there was a certain justification for that fear. But does that allow him to actively destroy someone else's property, even though the other person has already created the situation where he feels the need to do just that?
Well, I would say that goes partly to what Joe was talking about, whether he was afraid about what was going to happen or not. If he thought it was okay to destroy, to freeze the chickens and keep them there, then whether there was going to be a penalty for that or not doesn't matter if he's okay with the original decision. If he said it's okay to store these chickens here, because if it's not, and he's afraid that if somebody finds these, if I'm storing property, I think, well, I'm not sure it's stolen or not, but unless I know for sure, I'm going to keep it here. But if the police are showing up, then I'm going to get rid of it just in case it might be stolen. I think that's a different situation. So I think that's the value of, but I think it, every time I have a little knot in my stomach doesn't necessarily lead me to think about all potential future things that are going to occur. So I think in theory, that has a lot of value. But I think that it becomes a difficult question once I've taken on freezing the chickens. But, you know, and I was wondering, Diane, from what you said, with you would like them to just shake hands because they both could have handled this differently. Would it have made a difference if it was $100,000 car as opposed to some cases of chickens in terms of that analysis of it?
Well, you wouldn't freeze $100,000 car. So I think the part about this fact pattern that doesn't smell right is this issue about the expiration date, when they're fresh, when they're frozen, because even here, we're mixing it up. So if the starting point of the story is, I have property and it's frozen, we know it's frozen because he's saying that his freezer is broken and that's why he needs to store it in somebody else's freezer. The issue about the expiration date, you know, if Daniel is a restaurateur, then he should understand about poultry, expiration dates, being fresh, being frozen. And the fact that he questioned it, to me, just meant that he was letting Michael down by not pushing the issue and saying, I'm not sure about this and I don't want to run the risk. But he did take on the risk and he took it on for 3 months. And that, to me, goes beyond what the agreement was. Did he forget about it? Apparently not, because he kept calling to give Michael the opportunity to come and pick them up. Why was he stringing it along so long? And was he not thinking about the potential of food inspectors coming? I think the trouble with the fact pattern is that two people agreed to do something, and neither one of them held up their end of the agreement. Daniel, meaning that he didn't come back in a couple of weeks to get his property, and Michael not doing a little bit more than just calling him and saying, come and get this. And we don't know what Michael's responses to Daniel's calls were. So to me, regardless of the type of property or the expense of the property, both people had something here to do. And at the end of the day, they failed to do it. Michael failed to come and get his property, and Daniel failed to protect it.
Aggressively destroyed it.
I'd like to kind of bring a similar scenario to the table. If you think about companies who do business with vendors that they then later find out, I'm going to air quote, later find out are doing bad things. Let's just make one up, like a clothing factory that might believe that they have child labor in a foreign country being used. They might not feel good about it, but they don't do anything about it until they hear that a regulator is coming in and they're going to really look at where your products are made and going to be inspected. And then you make the decision to really look into that company and or your vendor and see if it's proper. And again, if I think of this in that same scenario, the reactive nature of making decisions is in my mind never the right answer. It's the proactive looking at things, whether that's, I think somebody already said it, stopping to think. When you get that gut feeling, we need to think, is this the right thing to do? The right vendor to use, the right decision to make. So I feel like this does happen more in the real world than even just this small scenario. So I do like Diane's idea of them shaking hands, because in my mind, they both had an unethical part to play in this, because neither one of them, to me, fully in my definition of ethics, acted ethically. Daniel from the beginning, or sorry, do I have it mixed up? And whoever didn't come get it, that whole promise is a promise thing. So, but yes, I think, at some point it was a loss.
Well, they both were behaving in the heat of the moment. I mean, it wasn't the heat of the moment with each of the phone calls that Daniel was making, but it became the heat of the moment because he was afraid of the inspection. And it wasn't the heat of the moment until Michael found out that he put the chickens out back. And in that moment, when you feel like the lion's chasing you, even if it's not, I mean, I think about that most common phrase that I run into when people are in conflict, whether it's me or somebody else, it's always, why don't you change so I'll feel better? Right? I mean, that's what I think all the time. I mean, I'm thinking, well, if I just talked a little louder, used some different words, you would understand that I'm right. So they're both stuck in at least this moment we're presented with righteousness that makes that conversation difficult.
Yeah. To go back, Yonason, when you said, helping a friend is a personal value, I personally, and this is again, my personal stance is, I would never compromise my own personal values to help a friend if I felt like it was something I didn't agree with. So maybe it's talking about which of your values trumps another, in this scenario, which I think, again, going back to what proactive decisions could we have made to not put him in this situation where you're asking, is it okay that he threw away all the chickens?
Yeah, and I think that that's very often what ethics comes down to is a prioritizing our values. There's, that's why we grapple with gray. Though it's black and white, that's pretty straightforward. But imagine if Daniel had said, I just don't feel comfortable having these chickens with expired labels in my freezer. Imagine how Michael would have responded at that point. Oh, come on, it's not.
If it's a
My
true
word
friend,
for it, it's not a big deal.
and in my mind, a true friend would respect your decision, and that's why you surround yourself with your people, right, that have your same values system, and that's something I firmly believe in. And I think there is testing of friendships that happens every single day, and a lot of it has to do with ethics.
Oh yeah.
Well, and even people with our true value systems, when you get to the gray area, find themselves not necessarily agreeing. And I find sometimes even with what Michael did, that might have been, or what Daniel did, maybe deferring more to the friendship part of the value. Part of friendship is not being absolutely sure that you're right all the time. I mean, it sounds like there was a little bit of a doubt for Michael, and they weren't going to go, or Daniel, they weren't going to go research this issue. Apparently we needed the chickens to be frozen. And I think that's when those value issues are really tough. You're with somebody that you think has the same values. There is some gray area. We don't have time to fully research it. Am I going to trust what you say, or am I going to pay more attention to the knot in my stomach? And it sounds like for you, Joe, you're going to pay more attention to the knot in your stomach. And I would say until presented with it, I don't know. I'm brilliant with hindsight. So that knot plays into exactly the conflict in the values.
It does.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Sam. There was a case that apparently this is actually a real case that happened, and in deciding it was taken to a rabbinic authority, and in deciding it, he found a precedent in which furniture had been stored in a warehouse, and they were the people who had put it there had fallen behind in their payments. And the people in the warehouse, they couldn't afford to continue to pay for this, to give up the income that they could get from renting out that space to somebody else. So they wanted to know if they were allowed by Jewish law to take this furniture, whatever it was, and put it out on the street, because it was no person was no longer paying for it. And they were told that they could move it to another unit and store it somewhere else, but they could sell whatever they needed to pay for the storage. Now, they weren't allowed to simply put it out where it would be stolen or destroyed. They had to continue to take care of it, but they didn't have to take care of it at their own expense. So, obviously our society doesn't always function according to Jewish law, but it's an interesting angle to try to balance my commitment to doing what I would like to be able to do, what I initially contracted to do, when the other party's not living up to their obligations. It doesn't give me carte blanche to just say I'm completely off the hook, but it doesn't hold me prisoner to terms that I would never have agreed to in the first place.
I think we have officially figured out why there are so many contracts, formally written contracts in our society today, because a handshake no longer works. And that is the sad state of affairs, as I see it, because neither one of them really at the end of the day lived up to their commitment. Had there been a contract exactly what we could do after 2 weeks was up with the chicken, we wouldn't even be discussing this, because it would have been perhaps written down, and there wouldn't be this argument of who owes who for the chickens. So I think that because society has stopped functioning on commitment and we don't always know what the right answer is. We tend to try to write it down and follow that instead. And we hold ourselves to something. And I think, yeah, I just think that's in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, it is interesting how things have changed.
I think that's
All I can say is even with the contracts, there's plenty of business mediating them.
I'm sure. I'm
Yeah.
sure. Absolutely. There's always that fine print or those loopholes in those contracts, right? Too. So I completely
Yeah,
you
I
got
think
us
that's
one step, but not all the way.
yeah. Well, thank you for that. I think that's a nice point to wrap up on. That, the more that we hold ourselves accountable, the more we contribute to a society in which we're guided by values. And at the same time, we have to recognize that that's not always the case. And to be clear and upfront in terms of spelling out the obligations and in terms of identifying potential points of future conflict, we can head off a lot of these kinds of problems before they arise. And that's really the most ethical approach, is to prevent problems before they arise. So thank you all. Sam Artery, Joe Irvin, Diane Wiska, grateful for you and your contributions to this conversation. I do hope you will join me again. For those of you who are watching and listening, if you'd like to suggest an ethical scenario or a dilemma for discussion, please go to my website, YonasonGoldson.com. You can use the contact information. Submit your proposal. If it's compelling, we'll definitely take it up. If you'd like to raise your ethical awareness, you can also go to YonasonGoldson.com/freebie, FREEBIE, and you can request a free ebook, infographic, or white paper. Please join us again next week for another ethical discussion as our panel grapples with the gray.